Persona 5 has some of the most interesting characters out of almost any other game that I've played. Unlike the previous two entries in the series, it seems like Persona 5 is largely focused on the world around us rather than just overcoming personal problems. In Persona 4, the characters seem to all have the common struggle of showing a fake version of themselves to the world. In Persona 3, the characters struggle to deal with the concept of death in whichever way that manifests for them. The traumas they face in those games all seem to have an incredible amount of inward focus. In Persona 5 though, the idea of helping those in need and rebelling against injustice are essentially the main themes of the game. Each of the main characters seems to have their own traumas that define how they represent these themes, and today I hope to shed some light on some of my favorites in the game. I won't cover every single one, but rather those that I feel represent the vast majority of players and everyday people. Also, I'll be saving my analysis of the main character for the end, so stick around for that. Oh, and spoiler warning, obviously. Starting off, let's talk about the first character we see go through major struggles in the game, besides the main character of course, Ann Takamaki. The first encounter with her is quite simple, only seeing her get into a car with the PE teacher while it's raining. Rumors began to spread throughout school that she had been having relations with that teacher, Mr. Kamoshida. At this point in the game though, we know that Kamoshida is an evil person and has been mentally and physically abusing his students, including the girls. Ann isn't on his team, but her best friend Shiho is, and she's clearly covered in bruises and is mentally destroyed. Eventually, we find Ann in the subways on a phone call, where she's obviously talking to Kamoshida. She decides to fill us in on the conversation after a little convincing, and we learn that she had been entertaining Kamoshida's advances only because of the looming threat of him taking Shiho off of the starting lineup in volleyball. She never went any further than just talking with him though, and when he tried to get her to come over to his house, she obviously knows what he wants and turns him down. And now we finally see the true side of Ann. Throughout the school, people had been spreading rumors about her, but in reality, all she wanted to do was help her only friend. As nice as it would be to say that Ann's problems went away after talking about this with the main character, all we really did was comfort her in this moment. Gameplay wise, this is where things get intertwined with the story. In Persona 5, we have to explore places called palaces, and these are essentially manifestations of someone's distorted psyche. The first palace we encounter is Kamoshida's, and in here we find shadow versions of Ann and Kamoshida. These are not actually them, but the version of them in the mind of Kamoshida. Clearly, he doesn't view Ann for much more than her looks. Anyway, back to the story. The day after Ann had her issue with Kamoshida, we see Shiho jump off the top of the school. Fortunately, she survived, but not without extreme physical and emotional damage. Attempting to learn more, we talk to another victim of Kamoshida's wrath, Mishima, and he tells us that all of the rumors about him were true. He would routinely nominate his students and hit them for no reason. Furthermore, Mishima said that he had called Shiho to his office the day Ann turned him down and probably did something really bad to her. When our companion Ryuji hears about this, he runs to Kamoshida's office to confront him. This sets off the first real objective of stealing the heart of Kamoshida, essentially defeating his shadow self and making him take responsibility and accountability for his actions. In the palace, Ann manages to find herself captured by Shadow Kamoshida, and he tells her that he did in fact S.A. Shiho, and that Ann is to blame for it. Now obviously, hearing this terrible, disgusting news sets Ann off, and just as Kamoshida was about to have the main party killed, she awakens to her persona and saves everybody. Ultimately, this is the main narrative of Ann that influences her actions throughout the game. In her Social Link story, it goes a little bit more in depth on how she overcomes her guilt from what happened to Shiho. Despite Persona 5 not actually seeming like a very dark game, this was actually gut-wrenching to play through, especially once you realize how serious the situation was. On my first playthrough, I loved the gameplay so much I didn't really notice, but the second time, wow. This one particular instance at the beginning of the game is an extreme representation of what happens to kind people who sacrifice everything for others. Ann has no reason to be a kind person. She's constantly bullied or ignored for her looks, and she doesn't even have any friends besides Shiho. So the fact that she was willing to fake being in a relationship with a child-loving grown man just so her friend wouldn't get kicked off the volleyball team or abused is genuinely amazing. Unfortunately, standing up for yourself typically doesn't come without consequences, so when Ann declines Kamoshida's request to come over to his house, the consequences are literally life-changing. Now, is this a realistic situation that you'll experience? Probably not. Like, this is literally the worst case scenario. However, it is representative of how it feels sometimes to be that kind person. If you sacrifice a lot for people you love and then decide to suddenly take your own side for once, others, it can feel like you're letting the world down. This dilemma that the kindest people often get into is one of the worst feelings because it's like you can't ever make the right decision. There are a couple different ways you can interpret Ann as a character, but I like to think of her like this. Instead of being discouraged from being a kind person and making sacrifices for her friends, I like to see her as an inspiration to continue to be like that. Because despite all of the things she goes through and has to witness, she still decides to stick to her true self and sacrifice herself multiple times for the greater good of others. And yes, she does learn to put herself first, but ultimately never abandons her values. And to me, that kindness is true strength. The next character I want to talk about is Futaba Sakura. Now her story is a bit different from Ann's in the sense of her already starting the story with a lot of trauma. When she was a kid, she was fairly lonely due to being a genius. Furthermore, her mother was not able to be around all the time due to her field of work in the metaverse, essentially research on things like shadows and palaces. But one day, she was informed that her mother had died and left a suicide note to her. From her traumatic childhood, she was left with crippling anxiety, depression, and the feeling that she did not deserve to live and that her mother's death was because of her. At the time of the game, Futaba is a shut-in who doesn't go to school and spends much of her time like we all did during the 2020 pandemic. Her connection with everyone else is that her adoptive father is the protagonist's guardian, Sojiro Sakura. He ends up taking Futaba in after she was mistreated by other family members. While still in her shut-in phase, she began a life of being a hacker who does good for the world, although eventually her alias of Medjed became so popular other groups started taking her name. She ended up changing her hacker name to Alibaba, and at this point she contacts the protagonist by hacking into his phone. Her goal was to get Joker and the others to steal her heart, similar to how they have done to the villains at this point. Eventually she realized that in order for them to do that, they would have to actually get to know her as a person, so she tried to back out of it. Eventually though, the group found out her true identity and discovered that she indeed does have a palace. Unlike the other villains they've stopped so far, Futaba's shadow self is not evil at all. The side of her that she suppresses actually wants nothing more to help Futaba recover from her trauma and live happily. While the rest of her story is certainly important, I think this is all we need to really relate to her character. Anyone who has suffered from anxiety or depression can probably understand the feeling of wanting to get better, but not actually feeling capable of doing so. Almost like a different evil version of you takes over in your darkest times and locks away the side of you that wants to feel alive and feel good. Out of all the media I've consumed regarding mental health, I think this is probably the most accurate representation of how it feels to go through this. Persona 5 gets exactly right how people will reach out for help like Futaba did and will literally do anything in their power to not let them be helped. It's stupid, paradoxical, and honestly burdensome for those trying to help, but nevertheless, it is accurate. The great thing about this is Futaba eventually does get better, but only after being able to admit her own ignorance to reality. Her mother did not take her own life. She was killed because of her research advancing to places it was not supposed to go. Futaba's genius intellect gives her an ego that makes it difficult to understand when she's right or wrong, resulting in her believing these self-fulfilling prophecies that keep her depressed. This is an unfortunate situation that is all too common in the world, which is terrible because most people think intelligent children have it easy. In reality, they feel the same pain, if not more, than an average person. Before we talk about the protagonist, let's talk about one more of the main characters, Makoto Nijima. And yes, all of the characters I've talked about so far are female, and well, if I'm being honest, that's just because they're written better and more relatable than the boys. Anyway, Makoto's story is quite different from Futaba's because on the surface, Makoto appears to be the perfect student. She is the student council president of Shujin Academy, well respected by her peers and teachers for her intelligence and high marks in school. Of course though, this perfection comes at a cost. After her father, a well-respected police officer, was killed in the line of duty, Makoto's older sister Sai became her sole guardian. Sai's job as a prosecutor meant that she often has to neglect Makoto in favor of her occupation and keeping her family afloat. While Makoto is definitely respected, she doesn't actually have that many close companions aside from her sister, so this distance with Sai leaves her feeling isolated. Sai often pressures Makoto to excel academically, dismissing her emotions or wants, creating a dynamic where Makoto buries her feelings and lives only to meet others' expectations. This emotional neglect, coupled with her inability to stop Shujin's corruption, like Kamoshida's abuse, leaves her feeling powerless and desperate to prove her worth. Makoto's turning point comes when the school principal offers her to investigate the Phantom Thieves, threatening her standing in school if she fails. At first, she follows his instructions out of obligation, believing that maintaining order is her only purpose. However, after following around the Phantom Thieves and confronting them, they call her out, accusing her of of being just as complicit in these school's problems by turning a blind eye to injustice. This actually made her take a step back and think about what she was doing. When she witnesses later the mob boss Kaneshiro blackmailing students and realizes she's been powerless to stop such corruption, she actually does something for herself and saves the group with her persona. Unlike the other characters, Makoto's trauma revolves around being emotionally ignored and treated as a tool for others' goals. Her struggles are relatable to anyone who has ever felt burdened by societal or familial expectations, unable to voice their true desires. I love this representation of a character who has so many struggles, but visibly you could never tell it. While a character like Futaba is clearly not in a great place mentally when you see her for the first time, Makoto seems like she never had any struggles in the first place. But when she joins the Phantom Thieves, she finally starts to put herself first. This doesn't mean she completely drops her identity of being a good student and a hard worker, but rather she actually has a purpose and a goal to work towards. In her social link, we see her go through the process of becoming her own person, which is super relatable to me. This is something that I feel like a lot of people go through when they break away from an identity that was forced onto them due to their circumstances. When things change drastically like that, it's hard to shed your former fake self and find the person who you truly are. Now finally, let's talk about the main character of the game. Unlike the circumstances of Persona 4, Persona 5 has the main character begin the game with problems directly affecting him. After protecting a woman from a drunk man outside, the man accidentally fell without the protagonist touching him and injured his head. He blamed it on the protagonist and forced the woman to testify against him, saying that it was the protagonist's fault. This results in him being sent to a different school in Tokyo and to live with Sojiro Sakura. This reputation of being a delinquent follows him to his new school, and the rumors spread like wildfire. Once he unlocks his persona, he's given the immense responsibility of leading the group of Phantom Thieves. These are essentially vigilantes fighting against some of the most evil people in Japan. Now, as the main character of an RPG, the developers left us a lot of room to insert our own character into his life. For example, when in conversations, we always have multiple ways to respond to people, and they're usually pretty contrasting. While the protagonist's backstory is pretty rough, I think his issues come up throughout the rest of the game. While everyone in the Phantom Thieves is essentially healing from their scars of life through Phantom Thief work, the protagonist is only taking on more and more pain. As the leader of the group, all of the responsibilities in battle is on him, and not to mention how emotionally draining it must be to care for so many different personalities with their own problems. As the story progresses, his situation just gets worse and worse. From being drugged and interrogated by the police to going to juvenile hall in order for a criminal to be prosecuted, he literally gives up everything for his friends. Any opportunity where he can take on a burden over his teammates, he takes it. While we as players are supposed to project our emotions toward the game onto him, the protagonist does still have some of his canonical responses to problems. He doesn't smile very often, is visibly distraught at the beginning of the game, and continues to have flashbacks and disassociates while remembering what happened with the drunk man on the street. Unlike previous characters on this list, I feel like the learning piece here is largely up to you. There are so many different traumatic events in the game that Joker struggles with handling, and yet he still perseveres. Maybe the overarching theme with him is to stick with your morals and goals no matter what. There were countless points in the game where Joker could have quit, but he was blessed with the power of leading the Phantom Thieves because he didn't have a quitting bone in his body. He has the innate sense of justice and desire to rebel against the forces that try to oppress him and others. To sum up everything, Persona 5 has some really dark themes. Many characters go through some unbelievably insane things that if they were to happen in the real world would be nearly unbelievable. The great thing about this game is everyone finds their way to get through them, and while handling your problems alone is important, it's definitely not ideal. That's really the whole point of social links in these Persona games after all. It doesn't matter if you're the most gifted person in the world. Everyone has off days or times when they're not feeling their best. But when you have a team of people who you can trust and they care about you, it's almost impossible to fail. It's quite difficult to find people like this. I mean, even in the game, that way that the Phantom Thieves are brought together isn't exactly ideal. But in the future, there will be a time when you cross paths with someone who isn't all too different from you. They have a laundry list of traumas and issues of their own. Maybe you can help them, or they can help you. But in my personal opinion, I feel like it's our duty to look out for those in need and to not be afraid to help ourselves too. Persona 5 is one of my favorite games of all time because it helped me realize the power of close bonds with others. If you feel like there were characters I missed that you related to, leave a comment down below explaining who and why. Hopefully this video was able to shed some light on some of the more complex ideas and psychologies in this game and even helped you in some way.